Welcome to Justice Talks. This is the podcast where we use trauma responsive practices to inform criminal justice reform. My name is Dr. Lori Hall, and today I'm joined by two guests. If y'all want to introduce yourselves.
I'm Jim Hassan. I'm a local law enforcement officer. Been with St. Petersburg PD since 2010, sworn late 2010, and have some experience also in the U.S. Navy.
My name is Lucy Lewis. I'm a student.
Awesome. So thank y'all for joining me today. Today we're going to be talking about use of force and de-escalation in policing, specifically within the context of trauma responsive or trauma informed practices. So really kind of looking at how we can go about utilizing the use of force practices that law enforcement have, or maybe modifying those to ensure that we are utilizing trauma informed care practices. So when we talk about trauma informed, we're talking about these 6 key principles that were introduced by SAMHSA that really kind of speak to the way we need to go about acting and doing and being with regard to the trauma impacted individuals that we're serving. So law enforcement are this is a huge problem or issue within law enforcement, that the individuals that you're interacting with have higher rates of trauma in their lives. But officers also have high rates of trauma in their lives. And it's complex when we talk about officer trauma, because we're not only talking about vicarious trauma. We're not talking just about compassion fatigue, but we're also talking about the trauma that officers have on an individual level, maybe in their personal lives, but just the work and the nature of policing. So I want to start by talking about use of force to kind of give people an idea of what we mean when we're talking about use of force. So we're talking about the continuum from verbal commands all the way up to lethal force. So maybe could you kind of give us an idea of what that looks like, the different techniques or tactics that you use when we talk about use of force?
So we used to go by like this matrix, right? And so it would start with presence and then goes up to verbal commands, and then, different types of physical commands all the way up to less lethal weapons. And then eventually, like you said, deadly force. And it was on this continuum, and you had to kind of train people that, you don't necessarily have to go step by step. Sometimes you do have to, jump the matrix depending on the situation. So we've actually switched to more of a scenario based kind of guide, I guess you can
Mm,
call it, where it takes more into account the different aspects of what is going on in that moment. So, an officer arrives on a call, and we have to respond based off of what those call notes might say. And the call notes are generated by the call taker speaking to the complainant on the phone, right? And so the
right.
complainant may say something to the effect like, domestic quarrel, for example, right? So they're saying, maybe it's a neighbor calling in saying that they hear the couple next door are verbally arguing, they're getting loud, and they heard some banging around, things like that. So officer's going to respond with the thought, okay, we've got a husband and a wife potentially that are in some type of verbal argument. Maybe they're banging things around. So that's how we're going to respond. And the first thing, like I said, is usually like that command presence. You want to show up, and it's not so much like presenting your authority. It's just it's presenting a level of confidence that
Mm,
you know why you're there, and you're there to try to help kind of get the situation under control. Because when people are calling us, it's because things have kind of gotten out of control in their lives, and they need help.
mm,
So that first is just command present. It's showing confidence. It's showing professionalism. It's showing competence. Showing that we know what we're doing, and then it goes from there. And so, for example, with the domestic quarrel, a lot of times what we'll do, we'll show up and the people are still yelling at each other, right?
mhm.
And so the first thing we want to do is try to get them to calm down. That's where de-escalation techniques come into. If you ever heard of the book Verbal Judo, just kind of trying to use verbal techniques and just get them separated, get them to calm down a little bit, and so that we can talk to them individually and figure out, okay, hey, what is going on? And so that's the initial thing. And usually, I would say majority of the time, that's all we need to do. Whether it's a domestic quarrel, it's some type of violent crime that actually is being, we show up, people see, oh, law enforcement's here. Sometimes that in and of itself, just that presence kind of calms people down. Now, if you have a subject that's particularly escalated, very agitated, we're having a difficult time getting them to calm down, it may get to a point for safety reasons. We may go to the next step, which might be, the verbal commands. Okay, listen, you need to calm down. You need to sit down. Those kinds of things. And so we're just trying to de-escalate at this point. We're trying to get him to sit
Mhm.
down, but maybe he doesn't want to sit down. He's agitated, he's swinging his arms around, he's walking around. Maybe there's something in the call notes or in the history that this person has gotten violent with us in the past. And so now we might, okay, well, let's go ahead hands on. We'll put this person in handcuffs, detain them for now. They're not under arrest, but we're going to get them in handcuffs, either sit them down on a couch, sit them in the cruiser, just to try to get them to calm down. And then it just kind of goes up from there. We go hands on, he starts fighting us. Okay, well, now we're into takedowns. We're
Mhm.
possibly having to pull out a taser,
Mhm.
OC spray, things like that. Again, just to try to get this person under control.
Right.
Sometimes in the middle of a physical fight, all of a sudden they'll just be like, all right, I'm done. Right, we're like, okay, cool, let's get you in handcuffs, let's get you sitting down, we'll go from there. And then, of course, again, it continues to escalate. They start grabbing weapons, they
Mhm.
start, showing more violent force, and, things have to kind of escalate from there. And
Right.
so when we're talking about use of force, I always try to think of it as like I'm responding to the environment.
Right.
What is the subject doing? What are they saying? What do I know about the call? Um, what do what's the general environment? How big is this person compared to me?
Right.
Um, as far as how do I determine, am I gonna if I go hands on, am I gonna be able to handle this person, or do I need to go straight to a
Right.
taser because he's just too big for me, right?
Right.
So yeah, so then and that's kind of, and again, I kind of went through it in the way of the Matrix because that's how I started out. So it's hard not to switch
Right.
to the thinking.
Right.
But again, it's a combination of everything that's going on. How many officers do I have? Because
Right.
that's can go back to the presence thing too. There's a lot different walking up to two officers versus say five.
Right.
And that in and of itself, you can get a subject that maybe they had some violent tendencies or violent thoughts or urges, and they say, okay, well, there's five people here. Now they're going to reevaluate what we're doing. And again, that
Right.
can be dictated by things like the call notes.
So when you think about responding to a call for service,
Mhm.
and using a trauma-informed approach, what do you think, are some things that you can do to maybe not necessarily modify, but adapt these practices? So you say something like command presence, right?
Mhm.
And so the way that you describe command presence, you say things like, why you're there, that there is a purpose for your presence, and that something is actually going on, right? Because I
Mhm.
know that, a lot of times you might respond to a call and they're like, no, nothing's happening. There's
Mhm.
no issue. There's no concern. And so just to show up, um, in the context of use of force, a lot of people won't necessarily see for command presence as a use of force, but it is, right?
Right.
Because it is a show of force, right? We're here and we're ready to do whatever we need to do to de-escalate the situation. So can you think about demeanor, tone,
Mhm.
posture, all of those things, and how those things can be modified to balance that command presence that you feel is required, but
Mhm.
also being aware and informed and responsive of the way that this can impact those who have experienced trauma, whatever type of trauma it may be.
Yeah. So obviously, I've experienced a wide range of initial encounters with all kinds of individuals, and it's definitely changed, how I approach certain things because, a lot of us when we first put on the badge and the uniform and it's like, okay, well, now you have all this arrest authority and this, you need to go out there and control the situation. And you do get, some younger officers, and like I said, I was a little guilty of it myself, where you show up and you're like, grr, I'm in charge, I got the authority. And I definitely recognize very quickly, especially for myself, that doesn't work as well as you might think it was. Now, if you've got some officer that's like 6'3", real well built, just has that look,
Right.
again, it might work for him. It doesn't work for me, and I don't think in reality it works for most. And so when we're approaching calls and I start to realize that, how I approach somebody in the human perspective
Right. Yeah.
is, then that's, I think, that's what you got to show up as. Yes, I need to show professionalism. I need to show confidence. I need to show some level of command presence or authority when I show up, but I can still be a human.
Right.
They're still dealing with a person who has their own background, their own experiences.
Mhm.
And so you get some officers that they do approach things very stiffly,
Mhm.
robotically almost. It's, Joe Friday, just the facts, ma'am, kind of thing. And that just it doesn't I don't know that it always worked, but it definitely seems to work less now.
Mhm.
And so from the trauma informed lens, I mean, obviously I know what I went through, and I try to remember when I try to teach some of the younger officers is when somebody, and I think I mentioned it before, is when we are showing up in what potentially may be that person's worst day.
Mhm.
They've lost control of their lives in some way, shape, or form. They've lost control of a particular situation, and they don't know what to do. And now you have to show up, say, as a 25-year-old law enforcement officer who's barely been outside mama's house, right?
Right.
And get control of this situation. But in doing that, you have to remember too that this person's going through something maybe in the moment that is traumatic in and of itself. And
Mhm.
so that's the first initial thing I try to approach things myself. I'm a sergeant at my police department, so sometimes I get complaints. And the thing about complaints is a majority of the time, people just want to be heard. The encounter may not have been well. They might have been talking to that kind of stiff Joe Friday kind of officer, and it rubbed them wrong, and now they're upset
Mhm.
and they didn't completely understand what exactly is going on. And so they'll call me, and the first thing I do is like, hey, what's going on? How can I help you? And let them
Mhm.
talk. Just
Mhm.
let them do that initial venting, because sometimes that in and of itself will get them to calm down because somebody is actively listening to them,
Right.
paying attention to what they're saying, and taking into account what they're saying, not just letting them talk at you and waiting for to respond.
Mhm.
So I think the first thing is to approach the situation remembering that these are human beings, that this is a bad day for them. How can I approach them in a way that is professional, show some level of competence and confidence and command authority, but also still shows them that I'm a person. I don't need
Right.
to walk up and be like, what's your name?
Mhm.
Give me the information. These are the facts that I need to know. I was like, hey, what's going on? How can,
Mhm.
are you okay? How can I help you today?
Right. And so that builds into some of the trauma informed principles, which is about voice and choice and empowerment, just really being transparent. So all of those are kind of built into that. And I agree. I think that showing up as a human rather than I'm a law enforcement officer, and we talked about that quite a bit. Putting the humanity back into
Mhm.
kind of not just police work, but and everything really, ideally. But so as we move up this continuum, I know you mentioned it's a matrix and the way that it works, but just thinking about it in terms of a continuum.
Mhm.
So going to other levels or uses of force, can you think about how these might be particularly triggering for individuals? And if there are any options for law enforcement to kind of modify this using a trauma responsive practice?
So one of the things that we are instituting at the department, we've instituted for a while, is crisis intervention training.
Mhm.
And so crisis intervention training is actually in our county is run by the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office. So they put on a class every so often, and officers, deputies from the local agencies will all go to this class as it comes available and as they're able to. Um, so we're gradually working towards the entire department being CIT, is what we call it,
Mhm.
CIT trained. And
Right.
what that does is it's doing what you're talking about, where it kind of gives officers a more trauma informed perspective on what people are dealing with. And it also gives them a better idea of what, mental health issues folks are dealing with, what those mental health issues actually look like and what they actually mean.
Mhm.
And so it comes down to just learning those approach when officers, when they're able to go to CIT, they're able to get that better perspective and that more open-minded way of thinking of how to approach these things. Because as we're going up the force continuum, as you said, okay, so initial presence, to the point of, say, if you want to take the next step up to the verbal commands or whatever, you'll have people that are just they're just outside their mind, right? They're
Mhm.
not thinking straight, they're not thinking logically. You're trying to talk to them, you're talking them to them in that calm, moderate tone. You don't want to yell, because all yelling does is escalate them to
Right.
begin with, unless you're raising your voice just so they'll hear you, because
Right.
sometimes they're just talking and talking and talking. And so that's where I guess the verbal commands come in, is it's more about getting their attention. And I think what we need to learn to do as officers is once we get their attention, like, yeah, I may look at them and say, hey, you need to calm down. You need to sit down now, right?
Right.
I'm being forceful at this point, but maybe it's enough because when I first approach, I'm just, I'm cool, I'm calm.
Mhm.
But then I jump it up for a second and it might kind of startle them a little bit. It's like, oh,
Mhm.
they weren't expecting that because I didn't show up that way. I'm not showing up at a level 7, right? I'm
Right.
showing up at like a 3. And now all of a sudden I jump up to a 7. Well, now I got their attention. Now, once I have their attention, I can bring it back down. It's like, all right, look, I understand you're upset. Let's take a breath. You really shouldn't tell people to calm down. I think I've said that a couple times, but it's probably not, it never really seems to work to tell people to
Right.
calm down. But um, you get their attention, you bring it back. It's like, look, I understand you're upset.
Right.
I get that you're agitated. What I'm here to do is try to figure out why and see if there's anything I can do to help.
Right.
Again, most of the time, most of the calls I go to, it works to some degree. Maybe not sometimes all the best. They're still a little agitated, but if they're looking at me and they're listening to me and they're engaging with me, I've taken that extra step and I've at least, I won't say won that battle, but I've figured that problem out, and at least now we're having some type of dialogue and conversation, if that
Right.
makes sense.
Yeah.
And so hopefully that prevents the force from having to escalate any further. And again, we're talking about one of those calls where it's one of those gradual increases in the use of force or in the levels of de-escalation. And I think that's another thing to remember too. Is like, yes, command presence and verbal commands and all that, yeah, they're on the use of force continuum, but they're de-escalation techniques.
Mhm.
Because if you show up and your uniform's all ratted out and you look like crap, you don't look professional, people are going to have a certain,
Mhm.
perspective on you. You show up looking sharp, looking confident, it changes things. So you de-escalate, you bring them down, and then hopefully you don't have to put your hands on them.
Mhm.
And that's generally outside of, eventually developing probable cause and making an arrest.
Right.
Hopefully we get to the point where, like we can have that conversation rather than
Yeah.
going to a hands-on scenario.
Yeah, because that physical contact can be very triggering for people and it can
Mhm.
actually escalate.
Yes.
And a lot of times it does, even for people that maybe have not been impacted by trauma, just because of the nature of who wants to be restrained, right?
Well, and again, we're already dealing with somebody that is agitated. They're already escalated.
Yeah.
And now I show up and I'm trying to be calm, I'm trying to be cool, I'm trying to be collected, I'm trying to talk to them, and it's just not working for some reason. So now I have to raise my voice, or I have to try to use a little bit more verbal presence, be like, hey, you need to listen to me, you need to pay attention, or things are not going to go in a great direction.
Right.
You try to give them that warning if you can.
Right.
Well, now, the person, is still agitated, throwing their arms around. Maybe they've even made a couple of threats. Okay, so now the other de-escalation techniques have not worked. So now we've got to go hands-on. And so when we do go hands-on, we prefer to have 2 officers. Now, where that could potentially help is, again, when you're talking about, just people in general. If I've got one guy standing in front of me versus 2, right? How likely am I to try to attack one of them if I've got 2
Mhm.
people on? So that's just good tactics, right? So but the second we put our hands on them, like you said, we could escalate them. And or
Mhm.
maybe it's not even a situation where they're already agitated. I've had situations where the person's completely calm, cool, collected, no issues, no problems, whether he's talking to us or she's talking to us. But then we develop probable cause. Now we're going to be arresting this person. Um, and they've been calm and cool, collected until the moment we touch them.
Right.
Now they start tensing, bracing, trying to pull away from us. That goes back to, again, a bit of command presence and verbal commands to talk to them, be like, hey, don't do that, don't resist. And I think going back, trying to keep that trauma informed lens in mind, it goes back to, we don't necessarily, just because they're bracing, tensing, pulling, we don't necessarily have to go to the ground immediately. We don't
Mhm.
necessarily have to start screaming at them. It becomes a matter of like, let's get a good grip on them and talk to them.
Mhm.
Don't resist. This is what's got to happen. Don't make things worse. Let's
Mhm.
get this part done, and then we can continue to talk if that's what you want to do.
Mhm.
And so again, it's constantly thinking and constantly running through the scenario as you're doing it, trying not to let things go any further than they absolutely have to. And again, responding to that person. And I think that's something that, some officers forget is they sometimes we do react, which is
Mhm.
when I talk about the difference between reacting and responding, I think for me, I'm talking about, the difference between just reacting is more like this happens and I just do this
Right.
without really any
Mhm.
thought. When I'm
Right.
responding to somebody, I'm looking at what that person is doing, saying whatever else. I'm taking a split second to run through my options and be like, okay, let's try this.
Right.
All right, well, let's try this. So
Mhm.
I'm responding to what the person is doing with the intention, if they're trying to escalate, to de-escalate them again.
Mhm.
And as we're doing this, again, we're just trying to keep in mind, I may not know what this person's history is.
Right.
Autistic individuals are a great example where the moment you touch them, they're
Right.
gonna go from a 4 to a 9
Right.
almost immediately,
Mhm.
and unfortunately, in those situations, they might be pretty difficult to de-escalate until you get your hands back off of them and then maybe try to talk to them again. But again, that's going to depend on the situation.
So do you think that if we think across the use of force continuum, these de-escalation techniques that we're really utilizing,
Mhm,
right? Do you think that there is a way that we can pay attention to and accomplish the goals that they're designed to accomplish while using trauma informed practices? And I'll give you an example. So if we think about the example that you gave,
mhm,
where this individual has been calm, cool, collected, and then all of a sudden you're like, okay, well, we actually are going to have to arrest them, and so we're going to have to take them into custody, and the moment you put your hand on them, they become escalated, right?
mhm,
So if we think about that, is there a way to accomplish taking this individual into custody
mhm,
while still kind of using trauma informed, where we're being transparent with them? We're saying, we're going
mhm.
to have to put you under arrest. Are you going to be able to comply? Are you going to comply? And I know that you probably do those things, but I'm saying within the context of not putting your hands on first.
So, generally speaking, in training in the academy, what most of us are going through is you don't necessarily always want to tell somebody that they're under arrest before you're
Mhm.
putting your hands on them. And the reason being is because of the potential, because now, oh crap, I'm going to jail, that in and of itself can escalate them, right? And so it kind of becomes a weighing option,
Mhm.
right? So if I tell them and they escalate, I don't have control of this person. Now he can swing on me,
Mhm.
and again, I have to respond, or when you're swinging at something, you're swinging at me, it's going to be more of a reaction to block that attack or to do what I need to do to prevent him from hurting me. Um, so it's a weighing option. Generally, the way that I've always done it, we've always trained is once we've made that decision, we give our partner some type of signal, and then we go hands on. As we're going hands on, we tell them, all right, you're under arrest. Do not resist. Let us get these handcuffs on, and then we can talk all you want afterwards. But
Mhm.
right now, this is what's happening, and this
Right.
is this is what is going to happen. So just you know, don't resist.
Yeah.
And like I said, again, I want to say I would say majority of my experiences, if you're talking to them as it's happening, sometimes that can help because they're listening to you talk. It's not just all of a sudden you're grabbing them and throwing handcuffs on them. You're still engaging with them to a certain degree.
Mhm.
It doesn't always work out that way. Sometimes, you know, you go hands on with them, and the moment they even see you reaching for them, the fight's on.
Right.
And if that's the case, again, I have to respond to the level of force that they're showing in order to get them under control so that we can bring it back down again.
Right.
So it's hard to say. It's hard to say. Yes, there are. I do know that there are some agencies that is the practice that they will tell somebody, you're under arrest. We're going to arrest you. And I'm not saying I've never done it. I have. I was a detective as well, and of course that's a little bit easier because most of my interrogations with them were within the confines of an interview room at a police station.
Mhm.
And so as we're talking, sometimes they'll start to realize they go, "Am I going to be under arrest?" Yeah.
Yeah.
But we're sitting down. Like I said, we're in a controlled environment. I know he doesn't have any weapons, or she. I know I keep saying he, but, you know, regardless of, gender or anything else, I don't, they have just as much potential to hurt me as anybody else. So, yes, in that context, I might tell them, yeah,
Right.
you're going to be under arrest. Out on the street, generally speaking, the practice, especially when we're dealing with people that we know have criminal histories, especially if we know that they get violent with police, um, that's not a good option because, again, as soon as you tell them, it's off to the races.
Yeah, and I think that we've kind of arrived at this place of the most difficult aspect of trauma informed practices: transparency, empowerment, and choice.
Hmm.
Those are the most difficult things to kind of really modify with law enforcement because, like, as you're mentioning, transparency, while in theory, it's a great idea,
Hmm.
but for safety and precaution for
Hmm.
law enforcement and the individuals that are just in the vicinity, right?
Hmm.
It's not always the best practice. I mean, I can think of myself, like the second you tell me I'm under arrest and I know my cortisol and my adrenaline are just going to start pumping.
Hmm.
And I really also like that you point out the react versus respond. And this is an idea that I talk about a lot. Respond is like or react is like an instantaneous thing,
Hmm.
and it's fueled by triggers generally.
Hmm.
And so a lot of times individuals are just reacting to everything,
Hmm.
anything and everything, right? But to respond, it's about that thought process, right?
Right.
And when these individuals are highly agitated and they have had a history of trauma, the ability to respond is diminished, and they're just kind of always on this reactivity,
Hmm.
right? And so to be transparent is very difficult for law enforcement. It's challenging.
It can be, like I said, on the street in the moment, right? If we're able to get hands on them, if we're able to get them in handcuffs and everything, then I'll be as transparent as you want. This is what I got.
Mhm.
Why am I being arrested? Well, you're being arrested for, staying along with the lines of the domestic quarrel type situation that's now escalated. Now we have probable cause that this person's committed a domestic battery. Well, you're being arrested for domestic battery, because we've got a witness that saw you slap your significant other, and your significant other has a small injury on their face, right?
Mhm.
So that's the probable cause. Now they may say a myriad of things to that, but that's where the transparency can come in. Is once they're in cuffs,
Mhm.
now I can work on, again, talking to them and trying, if they are escalated, trying to get them to calm down.
Right.
Another thing we might do is if they're agitated and they're not being cooperative and they're in handcuffs and we're trying not to fight this person, all right, let's get them searched real quick and we'll pop them in the back of the cruiser and see if they'll calm down on their own.
Mhm.
And again, sometimes that works. They'll calm down a little bit. We'll re-engage. Maybe at that point is where we decide that's where the Miranda is needed. We can do our interview, and then that's where I'll answer whatever questions you have.
Right.
You may not like the answers, but
Right.
I'll answer them.
Mhm.
So that's where the transparency can come in, and some of it does come to the officer's experience, in how they have dealt with different things. Maybe they know the person, to a certain degree. They know that if they tell them, "Hey, this is where we're at," they might be like, all right, they put their hands behind their back. I've had that happen too,
Right.
but that, again, that comes with a lot of experience, and that becomes with learning how to, read people's body language and, kind of gauging the situation. But from a tactical standpoint, from a safety standpoint, it is just, like you said, it becomes very difficult. I
Right.
don't want to say it's impossible
Right.
to be transparent in those situations, so it becomes a point where you're having to weigh, because you have to be tactical, you have to be safe, right?
Mhm.
And so you're trying to make that decision, and sometimes you've only got a few seconds to make that
Yeah.
decision. Now, granted, a lot of times I've developed PC potentially 5-10 minutes before I go hands on with a subject, right? And in that time, I may be trying to decide, okay, how are we going to go about this? Maybe I don't want to put hands on them right away. I don't want to put them in handcuffs right away. I'll read a Miranda right then and there, and then see if they'll talk to me.
Mhm.
You know,
Right.
um, and then they've had a chance to be heard at a different level, and sometimes that helps, again, de-escalate things. And then we tell them, like, yeah, He's like, because a lot of times they'll ask, like, "Am I being arrested?" Yeah,
Right.
you're being arrested. And then hopefully, again, we'll go moment we say that, we go hands on, and hopefully they comply, and we get the job done that we need to get done. And sometimes it doesn't work out. So
Right. Yeah, and I think that this is an area that the general public struggles with,
mhm,
understanding what's going on in these instances, even even just, verbal commands,
mhm,
right? They see from outside law enforcement giving verbal commands or law enforcement, making physical contact and even all the way up to lethal force, right? And
mhm,
so the media and the general public, they have this idea of what or this expectation of what law enforcement interactions should look like,
mhm,
and often they're not really fully understanding the full complexity of what's going on.
mhm,
And you hear things like, he's not resisting. People will say that, right? They'll
mhm,
watch these things. They're like,
mhm.
oh, he's not resisting. He's not resisting. But there are other things that are going on that they're not seeing,
Correct.
right? So can you talk about maybe some of those things that they're not seeing?
Well, I mean, sometimes it's the tensing.
Right.
It's something as simple as just they're just locking their body out to where we are having difficulty, getting their arms behind their back. And when you're talking about somebody that's like you were saying earlier, yourself with the cortisol, adrenaline,
Right.
pumping up. I mean, you hear stories about, women whose children run over by cars, and the women are like lifting the cars off their own kids,
Right.
right? That's adrenaline. They'd
Yeah.
never be able to do that under normal circumstances. And
Mhm.
so you got the adrenaline pumping in some of these folks. Some of them are drugged. And when I
Right.
say they're drugged, I mean they're taking drugs, cocaine, fentanyl, PCP, whatever the current, drug is of choice in
Yeah.
that particular area, and that can make them pain resistant. It can actually help increase their strength.
Mhm.
um, and some of them are just strong. I've gotten into, situations where we're trying to handcuff somebody, and it takes 6 of us to do it, because at the same
Right.
time that we're trying to take somebody into custody, we're trying not to hurt them.
Right.
Okay? We have rules to follow. I don't wanna hurt somebody unnecessarily, and not
Right.
just because of the rules, 'cause I just don't wanna hurt somebody.
Right.
I have hurt somebody in the past, and even though, it was because, we tackled them onto gravel, and it scraped up their leg,
Mhm.
I don't want to do that, but it's
Right.
what happened,
I think that's an important point to make though is, a lot of times people are the public are
Mhm.
watching the outside or from the outside, right?
Right.
And say, for example, in this situation, you're having to take someone to the ground and then their face gets all scratched and
Mhm.
messed up because this is like large gravel, right? We're talking
Right.
these big rocks. You're not you're not able in those moments, and this is what I find kind of humorous, but not, right? But you're not in those moments able to go, "Oh, let's look for a soft landing."
And you do though, like, if we're on like a gravel driveway, say, and we know we've got to take this person down, we're gonna be like, okay, and again, these are all like split-second decisions,
Right,
right? I know that there's grass 2 feet to my left. So if we can grab this guy and yank him over here, right,
yeah,
then maybe we can get him in the grass. But if he's fighting bad enough and hard enough, sometimes you don't have that time
right,
because you need to get this person under control, and so then the takedown comes into play.
right,
And now they're hitting the rocks. And then what folks aren't seeing, like I said, with the bracing and tensing, like I said, it's taken 6 of us to get somebody under control.
mhm,
You know, we're trying to incorporate different defensive techniques. There's
mhm.
actually, and I can't think of it offhand, but there's an organization that actually provides scholarships for law enforcement officers to do 2 years of jujitsu,
Oh, wow.
Brazilian jiu-jitsu,
Mhm,
up to blue belt.
mhm,
And with the point being that they can learn some grappling techniques that can make it a little, I won't say easier, but more tactically sound, taking somebody
right,
into custody. And
mhm,
so, and we have officers at our department that are black belts, and they try to put on defensive tactics training as they're able to. Unfortunately, we're not
mhm,
able to make it, always make it a department wide because of staffing, funding, different, all kinds of different reasons. but that's where it is. And, if I've got somebody that's bracing and tensing and I'm having a hard time pulling his arm, if I know an extra technique, great. But if I don't know that technique, now we're, you know, manhandling them, so to speak,
Mhm.
because we're trying to get their arm behind their back. And so now we're trying to use pain compliance techniques, which are things like, pressure points, stuff
Mhm.
like that. And as we're doing all of this, we're also trying not to constrict their airway. We're trying not to put
Right.
pressure on their necks. We're trying not to bend their arm in such a way that it's going to cause them injury, right?
Right.
We're trying to do all of these things while we're also trying to take them into custody. And so now that's why
Right.
you see, again, 6 officers piled on top of one guy
Right.
who is strong to begin with. He's on some type of drug, right?
Mhm.
And his adrenaline is pumping.
Right. So, on top of all of this that's
Mhm,
going on, we're talking about on top of just the situation at hand,
mhm,
we also have other things that are at play with regard to perceptions within those moments. We have officer perceptions of what's going on. We have individual and community level perceptions and experiences that individuals have had, whether they know someone who's had contact with law enforcement and what that outcome was, or they themselves have had contact with law enforcement and what that outcome was, right?
mhm.
So we've got all of these factors going into that that really are at play in the entire de-escalation process, right?
Mhm.
So when we think about individuals who've been impacted by trauma, law enforcement, individuals themselves, any community members, whatever it may be, it sets a tone for these interactions that law enforcement have
Mhm.
coming from every angle, right?
Mhm.
Because we're talking about trauma and the way that trauma influences that outcome. So, can you talk a little bit about what you as an officer do to help you maintain the appropriate approach given maybe your own experiences with trauma or what
Mhm.
you know about the individuals that you're interacting with and their experiences with trauma? How do you maintain that presence of mind?
So, I mean, first off, I try to remember again that I'm dealing with people. I'm not dealing with, we call them subjects or suspects or perpetrators. We have all of our terms for for individuals with whom we're dealing. But at the end of the day, they're human beings.
Mhm.
So that's always the first thing, obviously.
Mhm.
I mean, from a personal standpoint, dealing with my own things that I've gone through with just in life and on the job, whether it be with the police department or on the job, with the Navy, is you've got to handle yourself on the outside and you've got to take care of yourself. Um, when I see officers that are normally pretty even and cool, and all of a sudden I notice, there's a couple calls where it's like they're a little more escalated than normal, right? They're
Mhm.
not using their technique quite as well. There might be something going on in that officer's personal life that is affecting them, right?
Right.
Because as much as we try to keep professional and personal life separated, it's not easy. And the
Mhm.
reality is like it's the same brain, it's the same person whether you're off duty or on
Right.
duty. So, and then at that point, as a supervisor, I need to try to pull that officer aside and be like, hey, what's going on? And and ask them, are they taking care of themselves? And so, like for me, for example, I do see, I talk to a therapist on a regular basis. Started while I was working as a detective in crimes against children because I was dealing with some pretty heavy stuff. So, I started, seeing the therapist, which has given me some more perspectives on my own issues to help me better handle those. I work out. I I love being out in the water with the families, just spending time with my wife and kids, um, reading, playing video games, something to when I'm not at work to de stress myself so that when I go to work, I'm fresh. I work midnights. Sometimes sleep is a challenge. So
Mhm.
even if I've got an officer that's just tired, right, you're going to react to things, respond to things differently than if you had a full night's sleep,
Right.
So I've got to take care of myself when I'm not on the job, or it's going to negatively impact my behavior on the job.
Right.
Um, when you're on the job, you remember why you're there. You
Mhm.
remember who it is that you're dealing with and what is the ultimate goal. And yeah, law enforcement, right? We're law enforcement. So the goal is to arrest people breaking the law, right? We enjoy doing that. We like helping people. We like helping victims. We like putting the bad guys in jail, is how we put it, right?
Mm.
But even the bad guys are still people,
Mhm.
right? And and we've got to remember we're dealing with victims who may have just been traumatized,
Mhm.
battery, aggravated battery, you know, even a crash. We've had to give people tickets who were at fault for crashes who may have been more seriously injured than the other driver,
Right.
right? And now I've got to go to this person and, add insult to injury
Right.
by giving them a ticket when they're the ones that are in the hospital, you
Right.
know? So how do I approach that person? I don't just walk, do I just walk up and be like, yep, you screwed up. This is what you did wrong. Here's your ticket and I'm out. Or do I take a minute, talk to them, explain to them what's going on, explain to them the process. This is why you're getting the ticket, you know, and here are your options. Answer a couple questions that they may have and be like, all right, well, if you have any other questions, let us know, whatever the case may be, and then leave. But just take those few extra minutes to talk to them. It's just, you got to keep those things in mind. But I think the biggest thing is taking care of yourself when you're not at work. And
Right.
we're not always great at that.
Yeah. That's challenging. So yeah, and I agree. Officer well-being is extremely important, even individual well-being, right? To
Mhm.
make sure that we take care of ourselves is important, but also that policing, while it might be regulatory, it's very much relational, right? And making sure that we establish good relationships with the people that we're interacting with, even if we have to enforce something, right?
Yeah, and again, that's just remembering that we're dealing with people,
Right.
and it is very relational. I think the department, our St. Pete department is doing a good job with that, with initiatives like the Park Walk and Talk and things like that. We're trying to get out more and trying to talk to people, um, you know, having different initiatives to get out there and engage with the community in ways that don't involve their worst day,
Right.
right? Um, and it works. Like it just myself walking out and about, even in areas, like high crime areas where we're generally, have some pushback, but you meet all kinds of people. They're just glad to see you out and about.
Right.
They're just
Right.
glad that you're there.
Mhm.
You're like you might not even do anything. You might just be sitting in your cruiser typing a report, but they're glad that they see that cruiser on their street or in their neighborhood.
Right.
And so, and the better relationship that we have with the community, the more effective we are as a law enforcement agency, because not only are we, because we built that trust. And so now when we need help locating that missing kid, finding that suspect who hurt somebody, you know, we're more likely to get that assistance, that feedback, because we can't do our jobs at the end of the day unless people help us, because a big portion of our job is talking to people.
Right.
I've got, you're the person that saw the crime, right? But if you don't tell me what happened, how am I supposed to develop what happened? I mean, a lot of people say, oh, well, there's cameras everywhere to a point, but even cameras don't always show the whole story.
Right.
Angles can be bad, quality, lighting, whatever the case may be. Um, so without having that ability to go to our community and ask them for help and then be willing to have that conversation with us and provide us with the information that we need to move forward with an investigation, I mean, it becomes, I won't say impossible, but extremely difficult, for us to accomplish our tasks and our goals.
I think those programs are amazing just because people, like, perception wise, they see the ending of what's happening. They don't know how things happened, how we got to those use of deadly force, to use of anything. So just seeing everyone, all you guys just kind of just being there, like just talking, it definitely puts a spin on what people think. So they're like,
Yeah.
okay, you guys are just people and you're
Mhm.
just here to help us.
Right. Yeah.
And another
S-
great program that I think, I know we, St. Pete has, and then other agencies have something like the Police Academy. Or not, I'm sorry, the Police Academy, the Citizens Academy. Um, people get a chance to come in and go through some examples of training that we go through, and they put them into use of force type situations. Here, what would you do in this situation? And now they have to hopefully respond,
Right.
but react to whatever it is the subject is doing and make a decision on what they're going to do. And they see how quick it happens,
Right.
how fast it happens. And that can help with their perception as well. It's like, oh, well, these officers, they don't have 30 seconds to make that
Mhm.
decision. They have less than a split second to decide, am I going to go hands on?
Mhm.
Can I talk this person down? Do I have to go to a taser? Or God forbid, do I have to go to my firearm?
Right. Absolutely. They have the luxury of hindsight
Yeah.
where officers don't, right?
Yeah.
Officers do not know what the outcome is going to be, and that makes these interactions even more difficult and challenging. And we can sit around and say all day, like in theory, this is what you should have done.
Hmm.
But in practice, the factors that are at play are much more complex. But to use trauma informed or trauma responsive policing, first and foremost, we have to maintain officer well-being. We also have to, I would say, educate our public a little bit more on what law enforcement involves in more complex ways. And then also understand that for law enforcement, policing is very much relational. And it's important that we build those relationships with the community and with individuals to ensure officer safety and community safety. All right. Well, thank y'all for joining me today. This is Justice Talks. This is the podcast where we use trauma responsive practices to inform criminal justice reform. Thank you.